From Bowling Green State University and the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society, this is BG Ideas.
I'm going to show you this with a wonderful experiment.
You're listening to the Big Ideas podcast, a collaboration between the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society and the School of Media and Communication at Bowling Green State University. I'm Jolie Sheffer, Professor of English and American Culture Studies and the Director of ICS. As always, the opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of BGSU or its employees. Bowling Green State University and its campuses are situated in the Great Black Swamp and the Lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations, present and past, who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts toward decolonizing history, and we thank the indigenous individuals and communities who've been living and working on this land from time immemorial. Today I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Angela Ahlgren, who is a spring 2023 ICS faculty fellow. Angela teaches theater history and performance studies in the Department of Theater, Film, and Dance, and serves as graduate coordinator for the MA and Ph.D. programs in theater. Her fellowship project is Places Please, Stage Managers, Gender, and Invisible Labor. Thanks for joining me today, Angie.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You are now an associate professor in theater and film. What did your particular academic journey look like to get you to this point and to this particular project? Can you give us some of the major turns for you in your career?
When I went to college at Augsburg College in Minneapolis, which is now Augsburg University. And it was a very small program, and I was a stage manager. I stage managed a couple of shows while I was there. I think, like a lot of the people that I've interviewed for this project, I was someone who really loved being a part of theater, but also wasn't really wanting to be on stage and that kind of thing. And so that led to a couple of years post-graduation doing some stage management work while also waiting tables and doing, those other kinds of post-college jobs. And eventually, I started working with Theater Moo in Minneapolis, which is an Asian American theater company, and there started to be this nexus for me of working with them as a stage manager. And then after a couple of years, I also went back to do my master's in English at University of Minnesota. And as it happened, as I was part of this Asian American theater company, Josephine Lee, who's an Asian Americanist at Minnesota, was also there, and she was my advisor. And so I think through her and a couple of other Asian American faculty, I sort of started to build a kind of larger interest in Asian American performance, which also was involved in me being a taiko performer, which was the subject of my first book. So this is all very complicated, but they're sort of knit together in a way. And when I did my PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, and that was in performance as public practice, so really a theater history, performance studies program. And yeah, my dissertation work was on taiko performance, which was very connected to Asian American performance. And so, I never really thought about writing about stage management until I was already a faculty member in one of my first jobs, where I started to kind of see that role from a different perspective as a faculty member concerned about how students' labor and, time was being used. And so, it just started as an inkling, really thinking about that could be a project, and then realizing nobody has really, now at this point, a few people have written about stage management, but there's not a big body of work on it. And so, over time, it just started to make sense to me. At a certain point, my first book was interview-based. I interviewed living taiko players, most of whom I knew. And after that was done, I thought, I'll never do an interview-based project again. It's so much work. It's so much emotional, stuff. But after working on some archival projects, and I think also really after the pandemic, being forced into isolation so much, when I really started to have time to focus on a new project, I thought, I really want to be talking to people. And so that has been really energizing.
So you've mentioned that you have degrees in theater and English and performance studies. How do you think about the relationship between these different disciplines in your research and teaching?
They're connected, of course, in the sense that so many of the theoretical frameworks that I look to are borrow so much back and forth between English literary criticism and dramatic criticism, but there are also some distinct differences. I think that strangely in some ways, because I guess it would make sense that having been an English major and being a voracious reader and, that I might teach a lot of plays, and I actually don't. Like, I really find myself much more interested now in teaching plays that are not text-based or looking at aspects of performance that don't necessarily, sometimes they do, but are not necessarily tied to the literary. So for me, I think that a lot of the reference points we have are similar between literary studies and performance studies. I think I find myself just in terms of what is stimulating to me intellectually and creatively is moving toward looking at things that are not necessarily text-based, even though I myself write a lot and read a lot in my personal life.
Angie, will you describe for us the research you've been working on this year during your ICS Faculty Fellowship, and maybe talk a little bit about the ways it is similar to or different from kind of the interview practices you did for your previous taiko drumming book?
I knew from the beginning that I wanted it to be ethnographic and really largely interview based, because especially there's not like one sole site that I'm going to travel to and spend a kind of deep amount of time with individuals. But so I set up the project, especially this year I had a faculty improvement leave in the fall and the ICS in the spring. So it was really a wonderful opportunity to kind of focus on different phases of this project as I really get to dive into the actual interviewing process. So I set it up so that I would be able to interview a range of stage managers. So I didn't want to narrow my focus too early. I think that I will definitely need to, as I develop the actual written portions of whatever, or various ways that I might deliver this research in the end, that I will need to focus. But I wanted to make sure that I was not making too many assumptions right off the bat about whether people are currently working as stage managers, whether they're in a union or not in a union, in New York or in another city. I really wanted to talk to as many people as I could, really to understand what their concerns are. I didn't want to lead too much with what my ideas about what stage management is, because my own experience of being a stage manager is so long ago, really, and it was so brief compared to, I'm talking to people who've been doing this for 25 or 30 years in much bigger, more complicated systems than I was ever a part of. And so at this point, my focus in some ways is really on gathering preliminary information to really understand better what I am interested in exploring, and really also what stage managers are interested in having explored, because I think this is one thing I want to continue with the research that is maybe similar to my earlier project on taiko, is that I want there to be some degree of reciprocity in this work, that I'm not just using this as a launching pad for my own intellectual advancement, but that I'm really looking to the people that I am, talking to and spending time with to help articulate what's important to them, because what really they're going to be the audience for this work as well, I hope.
You, in your title, you allude to kind of the gendered labor. What is the current, breakdown of who's the typical stage manager, and what are some of the kind of common threads in that role from the folks you've talked to?
Yeah. So, of course, my sample is still small, but there's a really good resource that's tracking kind of bigger numbers on stage management through Elon University. I've been kind of looking at their reports to kind of cull together these numbers. And so, in a broad sense, women-identified folks make up about 65 to 70% of stage managers in most recent years. But that number is not necessarily consistent across cities or types of theater. So it seems to be the case that on Broadway, there's the balance is more toward male stage managers. And so there's some variation there, but it does really seem to be the case that, especially maybe since the late 20th century, I'm guessing, is that stage management has become a role that many women fill, and that is also in manuals and textbooks for stage management often really described in gendered terms, that it is a more servant, I don't want to say servant, but it is a role that serves the director, or a role that is seen as having kind of motherly or caretaking qualities, whether that is taking care of the director or the cast or the show itself in very different ways than how directors are framed, which, and directing is still by and large a very male-dominated field, and there's a sort of the idea of the sort of artistic genius that the stage manager is there to serve, which in many cases I think stage managers do want to serve the story. It's not that they're like adamantly not wanting to bring their support to the show, of course, but that I think the folks that I've talked to, many of them have said to me that they work for the show. They serve the story, they serve the artistic product and the process. And I think that may be a way of, kind of acknowledging that there is this pervasive sense that the stage manager has a role that is often framed as serving someone. And I think it's a lot of the folks I'm talking to are really thinking about how they are part of the team, how they're part of a collaborative process whose goal is to put on theater.
You also have talked about kind of the working conditions. Can you talk a little bit about, folks who don't know, like what do stage managers do and what are some of the maybe challenges to that work?
Yeah. So it can vary a lot, but I will just start with a kind of maybe looking at my own experience, because I worked for companies that at the time were quite small and did not have a large budget. So when I was a stage manager, stage managing for Theater Moo in the late 90s and early 2000s, I got to the rehearsal space, I swept the floor, I made sure that there was a table set up for me and the director to sit at. I would have, if there were changes to a script, we were often doing new plays. So making sure that copies were made, making sure that, I would sit in rehearsal and take down blocking in pencil and make sure that there was basically keeping a record of what happened at rehearsal. And then when you move into tech, the stage manager kind of shifts to a little bit more, supervisory role. So because you're going to be the one who's going to be backstage or in a tech booth, calling all of the light cues and the sound cues and communicating with people backstage. So this is kind of the moment that the stage manager maybe takes a little bit more ownership of the process. And also, of course, making sure that the designers are getting what they need out of the process. And so once you're in that kind of running a show mode, you're the person who gets there the earliest, makes sure all of the props are set where they need to be backstage, making sure all the actors have checked in, running a sound check, running a light check, kind of coordinating with the front of house. So you're really there to make sure everything just happens the way it is supposed to happen, calling places, and then of course troubleshooting. And so stage management can, in some places where they have a lot more resources, there might be a stage management team where there's one person and there's assistants, or people have kind of the areas of backstage that they're responsible for. So and a lot of folks that I've talked to too, it's like it can be things like making coffee. It can be things like, I remember when I took a stage management class, or I don't even think we had a stage management class, but my mentor in college would get us set up when we started stage managing. We'd have like a little box, and in that box you'd have Band-Aids, paper clips, pencils, erasers, anything that someone might need at any moment.
Your emergency kit,
yes,
basically, right?
You want to be the person who's like, oh, a problem happened. I have this from my magical bag. Yeah.
You've talked a little bit about kind of the stage director and sort of that kind of auteur attitude around the director and the stage manager. Are there other key figures that the stage manager is really closely interfacing with?
Yes, I would say that most of the stage managers I've talked to have talked about being the sort of the hub or the funnel, or really they're kind of this linchpin that the director is someone they're with a lot of the time during rehearsal, but they're also probably coordinating with the designers, or possibly if you're in a larger theater, the person who is running the costume shop or the scene shop, so that anything that happens in rehearsal, like a need that arises that has to do with the set or has to do with a costume or any other kind of technical thing, that the stage manager is that liaison between the kind of heads of all those departments. it also, I think if you're, and I don't speak from direct experience here, but from the people I've talked to who have worked on Broadway or in big touring shows, then they become also involved in working with producers and kind of, so they are really that hub.
With the stage manager in particular being such a kind of invisible role to the audience, right? I mean, the director is invisible too, and yet we do have that sort of in film as well, the sort of culture of name recognition, a photo and a bio in ways that, stage managers are often unsung. How do you think that plays into the kind of gendered and other kinds of power dynamics that you're seeing in your conversations with stage managers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a lot of stage managers don't necessarily want to be in the spotlight, at least not to the audience or the public. But I think it is clear that they, of course, want to be recognized. I shouldn't say recognized, but, they know that they're very much a part of the production. And so just to get credit where credit is due, for one thing. So I think the ways that it gets complicated, like one person that I talked to said that, well, especially if you're working in commercial theater where the goal is to really make money, a stage manager has a harder time negotiating for a better contract or really putting themselves out there in a way, because a stage manager's name is not going to sell a ticket in the same way that, Audra McDonald will. So I think that can be tricky. So I think they also have to be very deliberate about how they make connections in order to expand their careers and secure work.
We're going to take a quick break. Thanks for listening to the Big Ideas podcast.
Answer. Discussion.
If you are passionate about big ideas, consider sponsoring this program. To have your name or organization mentioned here, please contact us at ics@bgsu.edu.
Welcome back to the Big Ideas podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Angela Ahlgren, a spring 2023 ICS faculty fellow from the Department of Theater, Film, and Dance. Angie, your project brings together the disciplines of labor studies with performance studies, and you've talked a bit already about labor issues. Can you talk about how that comes into play with this project? Because that sounds like that is a new dimension compared to perhaps the Tycho work that you've done before. How are you thinking about this project bringing those conversations together?
Yeah, it's definitely new for me. The field of labor studies, broadly speaking, is a new area for me. Of course, I've had some experience with Marxist theory and, through all of my work, but there is a little connection between the Tycho work and why I wanted to start thinking about labor, there was a part of one of my chapters in the Tycho book where I talk about how, especially the Asian American performers, when they would go out and do performances, especially ones that we called outreach performances, right? It's kind of small performances in maybe rural areas or things like that, that often they would find themselves in kind of backstage or offstage situations where they would need to answer questions about being Asian American or kind of come up against some assumptions about being Asian American that really actually made them uncomfortable or even angry. But because they felt they were on the job, they would need to smile and be really friendly about it in ways that kind of maybe rubbed up against how they really in their minds wanted to respond. And so when I worked on that, I kind of turned to the work of Arlie Hochschild, who's an ethnographer who wrote about flight attendants, and she thought about it in terms of what she calls emotional labor, which is about having to use part of your emotional selves to create a positive response in the people that you're working with. And so she's really thinking about it in a kind of customer-facing way, and in some ways that was true of the performers that I was writing about. With stage managers, I don't, it's not so much that they are working in a public-facing role. It's actually they're not. But at the same time, a lot of them describe the ways in which they set the tone for a rehearsal room, or that they are often in situations where they need to use their emotions to create a different feeling that may or may not kind of rub up against their own, what they're really thinking too. We all do this, of course. That was one of the sparks that kind of reaches between those two projects. And so, a lot of labor studies in what I have started to read so far really focuses on bigger labor movements, or often is centered around unions, appropriately, right? Like this is Kristen Essen, who is one of my colleagues in the field, has written a great book called Working Backstage, in which a lot of that book focuses on IATSE, which is a backstage workers union. And in particular, she focused on the New York chapter. And it's clear that for those workers, being part of the union is very important. And for a lot of them, it's goes back generations. So it's central to them in ways that I think for stage managers, it's not. It's not that they are part of a union for actors equity when they join unions. And they need to abide by the union handbook. And often the stage managers also need to be the person who enforces the handbook. So they are in this kind of strange position. The union is definitely part of their story. It's like part of the larger landscape, but it's not, I think, part of a big labor story in the same way that some of the other labor studies and theater studies that have to do with labor have been told.
Right, and isn't that in part because in smaller productions, they might be the only one in that role, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas like when we think of unions, we tend to think of like, oh, all of the other people standing with you, and you may be a union member, but if you're the only stage manager on a show or with the theater company, that's a very different relationship to labor.
Right. It's the collective for them is certainly dispersed for a lot of people, and also for a lot of stage managers, they're just not part of the union. And this stuff is changing now because Actors Equity just very recently changed a rule so that anyone can join. So the sort of complicated rules for joining the union are really shifting. So we're actually at a moment where it's too soon for me to even say anything about that right now. But I think, for a lot of people in theater, and this is true for performers and stage managers, is that you may be in a city where it just doesn't make sense to join a union. It might limit the number of jobs you're going to get, or so I think a lot of the people that I've talked to have a not combative relationship, but just a kind of it's there. We have to we have to sort of work with it, but it doesn't kind of form the center of the story so far.
So in your interviews, and what are the kinds of questions you're interested in asking them about their working conditions and about kind of both the emotional, the aesthetic, and the organizational labor that they are providing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm really trying to ask questions that are focused on description. So I'm asking them to talk about how they got into stage management. How do they think about their role or describe it? What kind of mentorship do they receive? What do they talk about with other stage managers? What are the things that come up when you're having a beer after work? And then I also am asking, are there gendered or other kinds of hierarchies that you navigate in your every, day-to-day work? And so I'm trying to leave them as open-ended as possible, but also really, I also want to ask them in a way to theorize with me. So I'm asking, well, why do you think there are so many women stage managers? And people usually do have, none of us, of course, myself included, have a concrete answer to that. But I think there's a lot of interesting theories about why that might happen, and the interviews with asking about things that they hope might change, or especially how have recent, the pandemic is inevitably part of that conversation, I didn't even ask a specific question about it, but it's like part of everyone's story. But also, things like movements for gender and racial equality. Stage managers have a lot to say about that because they are the people who are setting the tone often, and who have at least some degree of power to advocate for people in their rehearsal spaces.
Can you share with us some examples of the kinds of things that came up in the interviews about the ways stage managers are trying to shift the norms in theater around some of these conversations?
Yeah, there's a couple ways. One stage manager I talked to has some training in intimacy coordination, and this is another area of theater that is really taking off, which is, an intimacy coordinator is someone who takes training to help performers and anyone in the rehearsal room navigate sensitive things. Because plays often depict very troubling things, sexual assault, or even other kinds of intimacy that's lovely and romantic, but that the actors don't necessarily want to be truly doing some of those things. So intimacy coordinator is about helping actors find ways for people to move through those kinds of things safely.
Right. I mean, there's long been like combat coordinators, right?
Yeah.
That you wouldn't have two people sword fighting on stage without choreographing very carefully what that looks like. And yet this is a relatively new thing to be thinking, wow, it's also, we need to make our actors feel safe to be kissing or getting naked or whatever it may be.
Exactly. In my understanding, and though I'm not an expert, is that intimacy coordination actually has kind of came out of stage combat. That there's that those two things are actually connected in terms of how they're carried out. So and I think stage managers are more and more going to be called upon in certain kinds of companies and situations to either enforce or have some of that training. So that's certainly one thing. Another person I spoke to has just said that she finds herself doing a lot of work where, though she is a white woman, she is in rehearsal rooms with people of color, often, sometimes with directors of color, sometimes not. And so she is very aware that she has some power to be able to maybe help actors out if they find themselves in uncomfortable situations or finding that they're having to deal with some pushback that they don't want to have to handle on their own, that she lets people know that they can always shoot her a text and she'll suggest a break, or she'll, find some non-obvious way to intervene in that moment. So, there's been some examples of things like that. And there was a piece in HowlRound, which is a newsletter for topics in theater, and Narda Alcorn and Lisa Porter, who have a book on stage management, they also have a post about anti-racist strategies in the rehearsal room that stage managers can adopt. And it's a really useful piece, I think. I looked at it after I'd been talking to some of these stage managers, and some of the things that the people I've talked to have said really, maybe they've read it, or maybe it's just something that's in the air for people who are, wanting to participate.
As part of the ICS Faculty Fellowship, we also want people to be engaging with the community to make sure that research is connecting with folks who can use it, and ideally that research be informed in turn by those conversations. Talk to us about what you're doing as part of your community engagement with this project.
Yes, it's still in the planning stages, but my hope is to have an online gathering of some sort where I can partner hopefully with one or more of the stage managers I've talked to already, to have a online forum where I can share some of the preliminary research, but mostly also hear in a more collective forum from stage managers about what are the issues related to labor that they feel can be changed and that they want changed. I think, there's the union, so there's things that happen in the union that might take a little bit more coordination and planning, but I think there's also maybe small things that a director or a company can do to make their stage managers feel supported and actually support them in ways that will just make their lives better, make them want to continue doing this work. And burnout is such a theme in the work and also obviously in our culture at large right now. So I think really finding ways to support all the people who are working on theater, to prevent some of the worst of that burnout.
Well, and particularly as you've talked about, right, since stage managers are also comparatively isolated, relative to like a theater will have many actors, right, who might talk with each other about labor conditions or, their work with a particular director. If a stage manager is the only one, it's harder to do that. So do you see this as an opportunity to sort of help stage managers find other stage managers and to compare best practices?
I think it could be. Yeah. I mean, there are some resources out there, because I've asked them, like, how do they, if they belong to organizations, and there is a stage managers association that some people belong to, some people don't. But I think the most, it seems like the ways that stage managers connect with each other, there's some Facebook groups, so there's some other online forums, but, and then there's just their own network. So it's not that I think I'm necessarily creating that, but I think it might be something that it would be nice to be able to connect people if we're online together, at least, because, so much of, I think a lot of the stage management communities are also regional. And so I am talking to people from a number of different cities, and there's so many themes between people who probably won't know each other because they're not in the same creative circles, right? And so I do hope that this can foster some cross geographical connections at the very least, and maybe find some commonalities so that if people find solutions and best practices in their own communities, say they something starts to happen in Minneapolis, it'd be great if that could also start happening in Seattle and Washington, Washington D.C. and so yeah, that would be a goal.
I know that you've talked elsewhere about some of the suggestions for labor practices to reduce the burnout and to maybe more equitably distribute some of the work. Can you name out some of those things that are in the air as possibilities for adjusting the stage management role to make that more humane?
One thing that I have talked about, at least with one or two stage managers, is just being able to have build-in understudies. Understudies is not really the right word, because in many places, if you have a stage management team, there is probably some kind of process by which an assistant stage manager could, in an emergency situation, fill in. But I think there's so many people working in companies where that's not built in. And kind of ironically, as one person put it, there's not enough stage managers, but somehow there's also not enough work. And so it's this weird kind of paradox. And so one of, some suggestions that people have is just having an on-call list for, here are some capable stage managers for if your stage manager knows they need to be gone for this day, or they get COVID and they can't come in, here's someone who can come into rehearsal and make sure that things are continuing to run until that person can come back. Particularly, I think one stage manager I talked to had a sense that there were all these plans being developed for understudies and what would we do if an actor falls sick, but there was not actually a plan for if the stage manager did. And, I think just to consider the fact that stage manager is as important as someone who's on stage in a lot of ways. And so those are some things. The other thing is, and I guess this is more union focused, is that my understanding from talking to folks is that stage managers don't get paid for some of the work that they do. They don't get paid for production meetings, and they don't get paid for like the time that they spend doing paperwork after a rehearsal. Or there are certain situations in which they can, but they find that it's, maybe the producer is like, why did you need to spend 2 hours after rehearsal doing your work? And I think they just want to be compensated for the work that they're putting into the show.
And thinking about kind of theater, it reflects our society, right? Both the best and the worst bits of it. It holds a mirror up to the way things are, but it also can lead us to think about things in a new way. How do you see, your work contributing to the public good in theater and performance?
Well, the one thing I wanted to do is to, I hope at some degree, make things better for stage managers, but also to let stage managers recognize themselves in the history of theater, let them recognize their value, and not just that they know it, but that, other people might recognize it too. I think there's also a way that stage managers actually do so much for particular shows, because stage managers are there not only when a play has already been written and they're doing a play from the 50s, but they're also there in the rehearsal room for new play development. So I think there's this way that they are always there. People don't, before other kinds of tech people are ever in the room, there's usually a stage manager, and that they are an integral part of theater history, and they're an integral part of making, like literally in the sense of crafting and making that theater happen. And so I think there is kind of a moment in theater studies right now. So I have Esther Kim Lee wrote a book about yellowface. It's called Made Up Asians. And she's really looking at yellowface not just as a kind of conceptual thing that happens, but as, there are makeup artists who learned to draw on the eyes, and there's manuals that describe how to do it. So I guess I think about this work potentially as having the effect of saying, well, stage managers have a material effect on how theater is actually crafted, and we usually don't see what that is. we can't see it as clearly as you can see makeup or a costume, but it is there. So I do want that to be part of the conversation too, because stage managers know what they do, but it's hard for people to discern what that is from the audience.
As a last question, any recommendations or advice for listeners? And I'm especially thinking about younger listeners, college students maybe, who maybe are fascinated by theater and performance, but, what that turns into, whether that's academic study or being a performer or just being an audience member. Any advice for them or ways you'd encourage them to engage with theater and performance issues?
Well, I think it's always good to know about how the sausage is made, I guess is the expression, but also, there are really practical, if people really find themselves interested in theater and maybe want to know more about how it works, especially if you're a college student, you can volunteer to work backstage at a show. It's a lot of work, but maybe that's instructive, right? To be able to understand how much dedication it takes, that you give up your entire weekends and to like sit backstage and hand things to people or sweep a stage. Or, people can volunteer in other ways, like ushering or just getting involved with a company. I think that I don't want to encourage necessarily, there's this fine line between volunteering and then kind of falling into unpaid labor that should be paid. So I want to pay attention to that, and at the same time understand that it's the reality that most theaters in our company are not for profit, and that they rely on volunteers, donors, and all kinds of talents that people have. And so I think one of the best ways to understand that more is to be involved on some level. And, that might not be obvious, but just reaching out to someone as easy as, emailing someone or tweeting someone.
Well, and just as a plug, and I wonder if you have anything to add about this, is in addition to kind of like university-sponsored theater, like community theaters are an amazing place where you don't have to, that there's lots of opportunities to get involved. They're always looking for people, whether it's, auditioning for something or just helping out with all of the backstage work.
Absolutely. You can be the person who is taking tickets or selling concessions. And once you're there, people really want to welcome you. It's not, it would be a rare case that your willingness to be part of the whole organization would be unwelcome.
Thanks so much for joining me today, Angie. It's been great talking with you.
Yes, thanks so much for having me.
Listeners can keep up with ICS by following us on Twitter and Instagram at ICSBGSU and on our Facebook page. You can listen to Big Ideas wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please subscribe and rate us on your preferred platform. For more information or to propose a guest for a future episode, you can visit us at bgsu.edu/BG Ideas. Sound engineering for this episode was provided by Marco Mendoza, with editing by Brendan Akatora. Research for this episode was done by Iswat Damiola Jinad and Joe Elia.